Hello, this is Jacqueline and welcome to Jack Knits. If you are a brand new beginner knitter, then this is the video for you. We are going to learn how to do this garter stitch, which should be the very first stitch you learn how to do when you are learning how to knit, because it is comprised of only the knit stitch, which is the basic stitch of knitting. So let's learn how to do this beautiful garter stitch and get on your way on making some really beautiful projects. All right, let's get started on doing this garter stitch, and let's talk first about the materials that you will need. When you are a first-time knitter, I would recommend starting with a flat needle. We're going to be using a US size 8 needle, which is a great needle to get started with some basic yarn. I am going to just use some worsted weight yarn here for this swatch. Worsted weight is a pretty medium size weight yarn. If you are purchasing yarn and wondering what to get, look for on the label the number 4, which says medium on this little image of a skein, and that's the perfect size yarn to get started, and that works well with a size US 8 needle. So the very first thing that you need to do when you are starting to knit is that you need to cast on stitches onto your needle to get that first row of stitches on there to begin to knit. Now, if you are unfamiliar with how to cast on, I've got a very detailed video describing that, and I'll have a link in the upper right hand corner. So feel free to watch that first if that will give you some very specific detailed instructions. I am just going to, for the sake of this video, give a very quick overview of it. So if you want more detail, watch that other video. But we're going to start by, this is called the long tail cast on, and we're going to start by kind of giving ourselves a tail here in our knitting. And we're going to hold that yarn in our hand in kind of this slingshot triangle type position. Then we're going to take our needle in our right hand, bring it up through here, bring it close to your base of your thumb, up through that thumb hole, wrap it around this strand, and then back through the thumb hole. Okay, and then now I've got 2 stitches. That first stitch was just that one loop around the yarn, and now I've got 2 stitches on my needle. So we're going to do that again. Forward to your thumb, up through that thumb hole, wrap it around this strand, and then back through the thumb hole from the top to the bottom and pull it snug. Back, up, around, and in. So I'm going to keep doing this until I have a fair amount of stitches on my needle. But again, if you want a much more detailed video on how to do this, please watch that other video, and that will walk through it real simple and step by step. Let's get our stitches on our needle like so. Again, this is called the long tail cast on method. There are many cast on methods that are out there, so if this one doesn't feel natural to you or you can't get the hang of it, just Google cast on, and there's a lot of different ones that you can choose from. Okay, so that gives us a fair amount of stitches to get started with our knitting. All right, now we're going to need our second flat needle, and we can start with our knit stitch. Now, there are 2 different ways to knit, and you may have noticed that if you've watched videos online of people knitting, there are several different ways. So you've got people that are holding the yarn in their right hand and knitting, and those that are holding their yarn in their left hand, and their fingers and hands are positioned in several different ways. What you need to do as a beginner knitter is find the way that is most comfortable for you. Try different methods, and whichever one you kind of land on as feeling the most comfortable, stick with that and keep practicing, and that will become second nature. So I'm going to show you both ways here. The first one I'm going to show you is called the English style knitting, and that is when you are holding your yarn in your right hand. Now, I am not an English style knitter, so you'll see that this is probably not as comfortable for me as the second version I'm going to show you, but you'll get the hang of it. So we're going to start by having our working yarn and our tail off the end of your knitting needle that's on your left hand. And the tail, of course, we're not going to be using. We're using the working yarn that's coming off the ball of your yarn. And we're going to take the right needle and insert it through that stitch on the needle underneath the left needle, from the left to the right. And then we'll take our working yarn and wrap it around that needle, and then pull it through that stitch again and then you can slide it off your needle. And there you've knitted your first stitch. Let's do that again. Insert it in that stitch right underneath the needle. Wrap it around your working yarn. Pull it through that stitch again, back through and off your needle. Insert it, wrap it around, pull it through and off your needle. Insert it, wrap it around, pull it back through and off your needle. Okay, so there we go. We got 4 stitches on our needle already that we've stitched. So that is the English style. That's your yarn in your right hand. Now I will show you how I prefer to knit, and that is with my yarn in my left hand, and that is called Continental knitting. So here you have to kind of set up your hand to position it a little bit. What I like to do is I wrap the yarn around my pinky a couple times, and that just gives it a little bit of tension. And then I bring my hand underneath it, kind of holding the yarn with my finger. That kind of gives it a little bit of tension so I can knit the same tension throughout my project. And now I've got that yarn ready to pick up when I stitch. So here's how we're going to do that. We're going to do that same motion as far as putting your needle in through that stitch, but now instead of wrapping it around, we're just going to pick it up from our finger in our left hand. Bring it through again to the front and off your needle. Insert it, pick it up, back through the front and off the needle. Insert it, pick it up to the front and off the needle. Insert it, pick it up, back to the front and off the needle. So this, you see, kind of requires a little bit of less motion in your hand, so it tends to be a little bit faster once you get the hang of it. But both methods produce the exact same result. They don't look different. The end result is just a different way to get there. So we're just going to continue this fashion till the end of our row. All right, so now when you are done knitting that row, you got one first row of stitches. You're going to turn your work so your working yarn is coming off the tip, and move that to your left hand. So now let's continue. I'm going to continue knitting Continental now with my knitting blank needle now in my right hand. I can continue on with row number 2. So just do it in the same fashion. So for garter stitch, like we're looking at here, you're going to do this knit stitch every single stitch and for every single row. The right side row or the right side piece of fabric and the wrong side. You'll notice that with garter stitch, the fabric looks exactly the same. That's because we are knitting every stitch, so it's producing little bumps on the other side of your knitting, and we've got a completely reversible stitch. That's what makes this garter stitch so nice. Not only is it the easiest stitch to do because you are just knitting, that's all you're doing, but it's also a completely reversible stitch. You can use it for projects that you want to look the same and attractive on both sides. And it also lays nice and flat. With some other stitches you'll see as you get to knitting some more, like with stockinette stitching, which is knitting on one side and purling on the other, which is the second stitch you will learn how to do. You tend to have some curling of your fabric, but this garter stitch is a nice flat stitch that you can do. So there we've got a good start here. I'm going to just off camera here knit a few more rows, and so you can see how it's going to resemble this. And again, I'm just doing it by knitting every single row. Okay, you see that I have completed a few more rows of this garter stitch, and I've been just knitting every stitch. So you'll just continue in this fashion until your piece is your desired length. But I would encourage you when you're first just starting out knitting to just don't be concerned about making anything in particular. Just knit swatches and just keep becoming more and more comfortable with knitting and practicing the stitch. One couple things that you'll want to just kind of keep in mind when you're practicing is to make sure that your tension is even. Don't knit too tight where you're pulling really tight on the stitches. You also don't want to have really loosey-goosey stitches. You just kind of want stitches that slide very easily over your needle. If it's a real struggle to slide your stitches on your needle, that means that they're too tight. If you see really big gaps in your stitches, that means you are knitting too loose. So work on your tension. That takes a little bit to kind of get a good tension going. And then also consider making sure you're not splitting your yarns when you're knitting. And that means when you're like inserting your needle here, that you only catch a portion of your yarn. See how I split that yarn there? We don't like that because that creates little funny loops in your knitting and it makes it look kind of messy. So make sure when you're inserting your needle, you're not catching any fibers of that yarn and knitting the whole complete yarn with your stitch, okay? All right, so when you are done with your desired number of rows, then what you need to do is bind off your knitting, and that is taking your stitches off the needle. Similar to casting on, this is the opposite of that. Again, I've got a much more detailed video on how to bind off, so you can review that in the upper corner, check that out, much more detailed, but let me just give you a quick run through of what that looks like to bind off your knitting. Again, a lot of different methods to it. Pick which one works best for you, but this is the basic bind off. And that is on that last row that you want to finish your knitting on, you're going to knit your first stitch, slide it off your needle, knit a second stitch. So now that you've got 2 stitches on your right needle, now you're going to take that first stitch, kind of grab it with your left needle and pass it over the first stitch on that needle, okay? So let's do that again. We're going to knit another stitch, so you're going to knit another one, so you've got again 2 stitches on your right needle, pick up that first stitch and pass it over the next stitch. So you're continually taking stitches off your needle by knitting one, passing it over that stitch, okay? Pretty simple, right? So that is binding off. Again, some people call it cast off, but you can Google different methods to bind off, but this is your basic one, and this is enough to get you started with binding off. All right, let me bind off all of these and then we'll wrap this up. All right, there we have finished a nice little practice swatch working the garter stitch. Now, after you have done a lot of practice and feel really comfortable with your stitching, then you can move on to making some really fun projects. So from some ideas to do with this garter stitch, you can make nice little coasters, square coasters. Any type of yarn will work well for that. That's a fun little quick and easy stitch or project to do with the garter stitch. You can also knit pot holders or washcloths. If you do anything for the kitchen, I would recommend that you use 100% cotton yarn. That's the best type of yarn for any type of dishcloth or pot holder. Or if you're really ambitious and want to just keep going with a nice long project, knit a big scarf out of garter stitch. They make beautiful scarves, and you can leave it all one strip, or you can seam it together for a nice infinity scarf. So lots of things you can do with this garter stitch as you are just getting started on your knitting journey. So I hope you found this helpful. If so, give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe, because you will see so many fun videos on really interesting knit stitches, basics of knitting to learn how to knit, and also some creative patterns. So come join us on our journey. Glad you are starting your knitting journey yourself. Thanks for watching, everyone. Happy knitting.